Okay, this is lecture 2 of McGerr. Let me start here. This one. Okay, so the progressives have a series of ambitious goals. They're all united by this idea of reform. They're wanting to reform and change people. So that's a unifying element, but what they want to do is across a variety of things that impact the upper class and the lower class, or working class as they refer to them. But they have really ambitious goals. So they want to reform individuals, right? And so examples of this are the behaviors of people that they think are acting in an improper fashion. So they want to ban liquor. They want to get rid of divorce. They see on the streets things that are awry, like prostitution and vice, and they want to get rid of them. The thing to remember about these progressives, it's not just that they themselves think these are things that should happen to other people. They're going to make it happen, which is why Carrie Nation is such a nice example of this, right? So Carrie Nation is opposed to alcohol consumption. She considers it a great evil. So in some states, Kansas, for example, it had been prohibited. It was illegal in the state level for people to have saloons, but yet there were saloons. So Carrie Nation takes it upon herself to change this action of people illegally having saloons. So she goes into them and she breaks them up, right? A shocking event, but it's a perfect example of progressive action. Here's a middle-class older woman who sees what she thinks is evil behavior, and she's going to take it upon herself to change it, right? And so she goes in and attacks saloons, breaking up the bottles and smashing mirrors and other things, right? And so this is something that it's not just that she's not going to drink or that she's not going to have her children or her spouse or whatever. It's that this great evil must be removed from the land. Right, so progressives are action people, which is nicely illustrated by Carrie Nation. But they also want to attack what they consider decadent lifestyle. So we have McGerr telling us the story of the Bradley Martins. Divorce is something that is increasing in percentage in the upper class. So these are things that are seen by the progressives as wrong and un-American, right? So they're going to attack this idea too. So not just say, I'm not going to get divorced, or I don't think people should get divorced, but to try and change the laws so people cannot get divorced. So not just changing things, but actively seeking to change them so nobody can do them because they have identified something wrong. They want to reform the working class. They see these ethnic immigrants flooding into the nation with their different cultural norms or different traditions. And so they want to get these immigrants to adopt American ways, right? Because they're the superior ways in their eyes. And American ways are individual labor, not union. So they're reforming the working class to try and get these radical notions of unions out of their heads. They would decide, these urbanites, these urban professionals, they're going to reform the agrarian world. And so they look at the farming or rural countryside, and they see these people living in what they consider backwards, uncultured ways. So they're going to work to reform agrarian life. One of the aspects about this as well is that this reform also takes the form of experts who are going to provide you with information. So you may have been a farmer for your whole life. Your family may be farm families, but a new group of experts is going to come and tell you how to do things more efficiently. And how do we know they're experts? Why, they have college diplomas, right? So there's this notion of credentialed experts are the people that should be directing how things are done. They want to reform childhood. They see children on the street, hustling papers, shining shoes, and they say, why aren't they in school, right? And they go into the mills and the mines, and they see children working, and so they say, these children should not be here working, they should be in school. So they're going to reform childhood. So these are just part of a whole set of things that the progressives are seeking to amend, right, to change. All these things are part of reform of whatever you were doing previously, you need to stop. And what happens is, increasingly, the progressives come to recognize that at the root of many of the problems that they identify, there's an economic root. And so increasingly, in these early days of the progressive era, the reformers began to focus on the economics, the uneven distribution and power relationships between the ownership class and the vast mass of workers, the upper 10 and the laboring class. And they come to have a willing accomplice in a surprising place. That surprising place is the presidency, because although McKinley, the pro-business, very conservative Republican, who had won re-election in 1900, he did not survive to fill his second term. He was killed by an assassin's bullet. And the person who was made vice president was elevated to the presidency. And that person is Teddy Roosevelt. And so a little bit about Teddy. First off, Teddy is a force of nature. He is undeniably popular, undeniably a public figure, and undeniably someone who can acquire votes for the party he chooses, which in this case was the Republican Party. But Teddy's also uncontrollable, certainly uncontrollable by the party bosses. So they faced a conundrum. Here's Teddy Roosevelt, former governor of, or then current governor of New York, former police chief of New York City, scion of the wealthy upstate old money family, the Roosevelts, the highly popular figure from his time as Undersecretary of the Navy, resigning his commission in the Spanish-American War, or position in the Navy, to form a group of Rough Riders who are going to fight in this Spanish-American War. Teddy mounts San Juan Hill with his soldiers and many newspaper writers in tow. So just a person who's incredibly well-known public figure. And so he would be very helpful for the political ticket to ensure McKinley's reelection. But they want to put him someplace that is not dangerous, right? And that not dangerous place is the vice presidency, because as John Nance Garner was to say later in evaluating the position of the vice presidency is not worth a warm bucket of piss, because in the structure of the Constitution, the vice president has very little powers. The only power it has is that he or she presides over the Senate and can serve as a tiebreaker in case there's a Senate vote that is tied. But aside from that, it has very little political power, although it's a very prominent position. So the party bosses congratulated themselves for getting Teddy on the ticket, working to re-elect McKinley, and putting him in a place where he can't really cause any trouble. But then McKinley's assassinated, and Teddy becomes president of the United States. And in the eyes of the Republicans who put McKinley into power, Teddy causes a lot of trouble. A nice summation of Teddy's particular worldview is visible in a famous speech he gave called The Strenuous Life, because in this speech, he's talking about how nations should act, right? Important nations, powerful nations should be involved in the heavy business of engaging in a strenuous life. That constant testing and probing and work makes nations stronger. And if they don't compete in this arena, they become weak and effete. So his vision of this strenuous life, in which he's talking about what the nation is really about, how Teddy Roosevelt views the world. So a little Teddy background would be useful here. Teddy is a child of old money from upstate New York. He was born into privilege. He was a sickly child. He was small, asthmatic, had very thick glasses. Teddy really didn't have to do anything because he came from a lot of money. but that's not who Teddy Roosevelt is. Teddy constantly tested himself. He took up boxing to fight men who were bigger than he was as a rather scrawny, nearsighted young man. He went out and he sought testing himself in nature, which is where he believed one proves one's manhood out there in facing wild nature. So he went out for extended camping trips, long journeys into very rugged areas, sometimes with a few friends, sometimes by himself. This is part of what Teddy Roosevelt thinks is the way one should act. One should continually seek to test oneself and test one's mettle. So Teddy starts off in this sort of worldview as he's a child of privilege. He's relatively conservative. He comes from old money, so he's not radical. But if we look at the political spectrum and say you have the left, the right, Teddy's closer to the middle. But over the course of his presidency, which would turn out to be the term he completed for McKinley, and then his own re-election years, you see that Teddy, who is relatively in the middle, moderate, increasingly comes to favor more leftist interpretations of reform, right? The reform movement and economic reform are things that Teddy comes to embrace and comes to recognize as important. And he's not alone in this recognition that there's an economic basis to perceived problems in American life. So the progressives come to recognize that prostitution is not, or not only, the result of women of loose morals, as it was referred to at the time, but is actually a sign of desperate circumstances. These women are in such desperate circumstances, the only thing they have to sell for their own survival or their family's survival is themselves. And so at the root of this problem is not that there are loose women out hooking on the streets. The problem is economic in nature. Women cannot find jobs to sustain themselves and their family. If they are widowed or abandoned, they are responsible for families in which they cannot produce enough income in normal means. So they have to adopt these more desperate things such as prostitution. The progressives see incredible disparity of wealth, right? So we talked about conspicuous consumption, the Biltmore Hotel, which employs more workers to maintain this huge Vanderbilt mansion than are employed by the agricultural department at that time. So this conspicuous consumption, incredible displays of wealth, underscores how a very small percentage of the nation is acquiring the lion's share, the overwhelming lion's share of the wealth that's being generated partly through this industrial revolution. And so to combat this conspicuous consumption, progressives begin to find support for taxation on the wealthy, higher levels of taxation based upon how much money people have, in a way of seeking to provide some sort of leveling of this accumulation of wealth by such a small number of hands. You also see the vast expansion of more and more settlement houses. In 1890, there were only 6. By 1900, there were 100. And by 1910, there were 400 different settlement houses situated in urban areas, providing this support and help from people motivated by social gospel notions. Right? So the progressives are coming to embrace more economic formulations of these things. Progressives also have very romantic views of what the past was like and this ideal that we should be aspiring to. And one of those places that's most clearly seen is in rural life, right? So the Jeffersonian idea of small landowners as living work by the sweat of their brow, right? Out working in the fields, and then at night by candlelight reading ancient Greek philosophy, right? So this notion of an educated yeoman farmer idea doesn't match the reality to what you see in these rural areas where people who are living very close to the edge, working excessively hard in order to make a go of it, finding themselves in debt, finding themselves in desperate circumstances, and certainly not reading Greek philosophy. But that romantic ideal of what the rural life should be stands in opposition to the squalor of the cities, which they see before their own eyes. Remember, these are primarily urban reformers, and so they see people crowded together in ethnic ghettos living in desperate circumstances. They see the filth that accumulates on the streets. They see the corruption that results in trash not being picked up, sewer systems not functioning properly. The whole graft system of corrupt American politics is manifest before them in the desperate situation of the cities. They also, so they want to remake these worlds as they see it. They also see children working, this child labor, and they're shocked by the dangerous jobs they do. And so they say these children need to be out of the factories and schools, furthering their education so they have better opportunities. They also promote the benefits of sport. But the progressives are getting a sharp pushback because the labor-owning companies or the factory owners or certain segments of this industrial production not only use child labor, they rely upon it. I'll give you two examples. Two of the most egregious abusers of the child labor system were mining and the textile industry. So we'll talk about what children do in both. So in the textile industry, the great spinning mills spin thread from the material, the raw material, manufacturing it into finished goods. But these big spindles spinning thread, sometimes they break. And so the thread has to be retied. And these mill owners found that children and their small dexterous fingers were better at tying these threads quickly more than adults. In addition, because children were smaller, you could crowd more spindles into a limited space, and so the children would tend to these spindles up and down, making sure whenever the strings or the thread breaks that they're retied, or making sure that they're able to change out new spindles for old spindles. Children were better able to work in these cramped conditions, and so the textile mills hired lots of children. They also paid them significantly less, things that made the textile industry happier. Same thing for the mining industry. The mining industry, it's a pretty simple business. You dig holes in the wall and then you blow them up with nitroglycerin or dynamite, and then you gather up that debris, which is coal or whatever other item that you're mining. And so in these explosions, they create fissures, some that are sometimes too small for a full-size adult to get in, but children could get in there and toss out these chunks of coal, so they were valuable in that sense. And also because you paid children very little, you could put them to tasks that were labor-intensive but didn't generate a lot of income. So frequently, children would sit over a conveyor belt where the rubble that is removed from the coal mining operation, there's a lot of waste rock in there, but studied throughout this waste rock are valuable pieces of coal. So the children would sit over a conveyor belt and pull out the coal as it went between their legs. It didn't generate a lot of coal, but because they paid children so little compared to adult workers, it was profitable to do so. So the progressives get a lot of pushback because ownership, the laboring owner class, or the factory owning class, are highly resistant to removing children from these equations because it allows them to maximize their profits. Okay. Before we go into the UMW strike, I want to show you some figures of how dangerous this time of labor was, right? And so I will tell you that getting figures as to the level of death and dismemberment that occurs in industry is really hard. There's no official record keeping, and so in the early 20th century, so it's difficult to get numbers for that. But the impact of this can be illustrated by some places where we do have some numbers. I'm going to show you some mining numbers in a second, but this is a death calendar in industry for Allegheny County. Allegheny County is in western Pennsylvania. It's where Pittsburgh is located. So there's these numbers are a little skewed because Pittsburgh industry is the steel industry, and there's also mining, right? So it's large scale, particularly dangerous areas of work. But this is just one county in one state in the nation, and it's for 1 year. So we're looking at the number of work-related deaths by day from July 1906 to June 1907. On this calendar, each one of those red numbers is a day that workers died in Allegheny County. So for the month of July, we see that 1906, we see 35 deaths. For the month of September, 37 deaths. For the month of December 1906, you see 48 deaths. These are deaths. January 1907, there's 60 deaths in Allegheny County, just one county. This is a world of work that is immensely dangerous, right? So, oh, let me stop that share. Get you another one. Let's see what else we got. Let's look at this one. Okay, this is coal mine deaths due to coal mine explosions from 1901 to 1955, yearly trends, right? So you see in 1900 to 1905, on average, annual deaths were somewhere about 750 people died each year, right? So this is a rolling 5-year average. And so you see as reforms are brought in to make the mines safer, you have new explosives that are standardized, you have the Bureau of Mines established, you have different types of, there's a Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act that comes along later, you have improved ventilation, right? So you see these improvements in the business result in the number of people dying of coal mine explosions, right? Not a relatively pervasive method of death in these coal mines, right? And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are laboring in these industries, by the way. Here's another coal mine and mineral extraction. These are 5-year average of deaths in general. So from 1911 to 1915, about, that number is a little bit under 13,000 people died in the mines, right? Plus, the dark blue is coal mines exclusively. The lighter blue is other mining, not coal mining. So now you also add an additional 4,000 people. So these are ones that we do have figures for, but this is a world of work that's exceptionally dangerous and deadly. And there's, you know, if the company decide as a matter of goodwill to give the family some sort of benefit for their husband dying in a coal mine or father dying in a coal mine, that was on the company. So there was no, you know, there was no regular association of what to do when people are injured and maimed in the coal mine. There's no regulatory oversight legislation that demands that companies take care of them. So now I want to talk about a particular strike. This is in chapter 4, still part of the second lecture. This is, you know, there's different ways of illustrating events in the past. One way of illustrating events in the past is to show something that happens all the time, right? So you use a regular occurrence of a thing to show you what happens. Another way of illustrating it, how things operate, is to show you what's known as an outlier, the counterexample, right? So this UMW strike is a counterexample. By examining this strike and seeing how it unfolds, and say, this is unusual because this is not normally how things happen. So by examining the outlier, it helps us to understand how things normally operate, which is largely the opposite of what we see here. So McGerr talks about the UMW strike of 1902, UMW's United Mine Workers. Remember that McGerr is talking about the working class, the laboring class sees their protection in collective action. So the UMW strike of 1902, they come with collective demands, and the strike begins in May of 1902. The workers in the factory or in the coal mine have the following demands. They say, you know, we want better treatment in the mines, we want to make more money, we don't think you're treating us fairly, and here are our demands. They say, we want an 8-hour day. They were then working 10-hour days as the standard workload. They said, we want an 8-hour day. We want an increase in the amount of money we make for the coal we produce. We want an increase in our wages, 20%, right? We want a fairer accounting of coal loads. The way the workers are paid is in the following fashion. They dig up or blow out the coal under the ground. They load it into the carts. They transport those carts to the weighing station where the carts are weighed, and then that number is recorded as how much coal the workers dug out, and that's what they're paid on. So relatively straightforward thing, but the way it works in the coal mines is in the following fashion. The workers deliver the coal to the scales, and then they don't see them weighed. The company tells them how much they weighed. And so they said, we suspect that the company may not always be weighing these things fairly. So what we want is a representative of the workers to oversee the process, to ensure that both the carts are weighed properly, the scales are working properly, and also that whatever the weight is properly recorded, because that's what they're paid on. So they want some sort of oversight on the weighing of the coal loads. They also want recognition of the union. These are their collective demands. They issue them to the owners of the coal mine, and the owners of the coal mine are not interested, so the strike ensues. Now, the owners of these coal mines, and I'm going to talk about vertical integration a little bit later in today's lecture, but the owners of these coal mines, they're not the owners of the coal mines, really. The coal mines have been sold to railroad companies. So railroad companies own the coal mines, right? And so this is part of a vertical integration system, which I will talk about in greater detail. But these coal mines in which the workers are working are actually owned by larger railroad companies who are taking the coal and selling it. And they say, the management of these coal mines and railroad companies say, we don't want to talk to you as a collective. We only deal with individuals. So you're on strike. We're not going to talk to you unless each one of you want to come in and talk to us. And then they adopt the usual tactics. The usual tactics when the workers go on strike is step one, you try to break the strike by bringing in scabs, right? So you bring in people to take the strikers' jobs and break the strike that way. Well, in this particular case, it proved to be very difficult. One of the advantages workers have when they go on strike in a place like a coal mine is that, one, coal mines are generally located, or any type of mine is generally located in a remote location. So everybody who lives in the town where that coal mine is usually working in the coal mine, right? So there's not a lot of extra population around to do that, right? So the workers have an advantage because there's not a lot of extra labor. When the owners try to bring in scabs, they find that people who are either co-religionists or co-ethnics are disinclined to take these jobs and try and break the strike. It's also harder to get the scabs into the coal mine because the workers are blockading the sole entrance to the mine, right? You don't usually have multiple entrances to a coal mine or any type of mine. You usually have one entrance, which makes it comparatively easy to block access. So for these and other reasons, the railroad companies or the mine owners are unable to bring in scabs, right? the ownership of the mines had tried to rely upon some novel tricks that American ownership had used, not true in other places, mainly because we have so many different immigrant streams. The ownership had tried to use ethnic conflict, in which they learned the bad relations between various ethnic groups and used that to their advantage. So coal mine owners knew that the Serbs and Croats had long-running disputes going back in their history, so they would purposely staff half of the mining crew with Serbs and the other half with Croats in an attempt to prevent them from working together. And another industry, the needle trades, the owners would actually have a seating chart where they would place an Italian man or woman in a seat, and then next to them put a Jew from Eastern Europe, in hopes that the Italian and Yiddish speaking individuals respectively would not be able to discuss and so find that they had common cause, that they were being treated unfairly, right? So the owners try to break the strike, right? This is the usual course of strikes, right? But that's not what happens here. The owners are unable to break the strike, but they're still not willing to negotiate. This is also another ownership tactic. Owners have deeper pockets, and so can withstand not making money for a much longer period than the workers who live so close to the edge, right? But nonetheless, the strike stretches on through the summer and is now coming into the fall. And with the fall, there is cold weather. And as the weather starts getting colder, there is an increased desire for coal. Coal that is not available because the workers are on strike. And so this is having impact in industry. Much of industry runs on coal fire, coal power, in order to generate the energy to do their business. So coal is becoming harder to acquire and more expensive for companies. They are unhappy. And people who heat their houses or cook in their stoves with this coal are also unhappy. The price of coal is continuing to spiral higher, and it's getting colder, so people are unhappy. And so there's unrest in a large segment of the American public beyond just the people who are involved in the immediate issues of the strike. And so Teddy Roosevelt, mindful of this dismay from the public and mindful of this dismay from industry, offers his office of the presidency as a mediator. This is unprecedented. The presidency had not adopted a role in this. And it's also unprecedented because Teddy Roosevelt wasn't saying to the owners, I'm going to help you break the strike. That had happened previously, where the government has served as an aid to the owners in breaking a strike. In this case, Teddy said, I'll mediate a resolution to this crisis between the two groups, the strikers and the owners, right? And so the strikers say, we are delighted to come talk to you, Teddy, and we'd be delighted if you help mediate an end to this conflict. And so they show up and are ready to talk. The owners, not interested. They, in effect, say, thanks, but no thanks to Teddy Roosevelt. Well, this is a bad publicity mood by the owners because it's abundantly clear that the strikers are willing to negotiate, but the owners are not. And the everyday people are feeling the pinch of this strike, and they increasingly find that the people who are being most unreasonable are the owners. And so there's this media backlash, and people are outraged at the owners, and they come to start siding with the strikers. This too is very unprecedented in American history up until this time. So the owners are forced to retreat. And so they come to Teddy Roosevelt hat in hand and say, gee, Teddy, we're sorry, you must have misunderstood. We'd be delighted if you help us resolve this conflict. And so the president negotiated a settlement between the two groups. And this settlement gives the workers some stuff, but not everything they want. So they got a 9-hour day, right? So they were working a 10-hour day. They asked for an 8-hour day. They got 9. They wanted a 20% increase, they got a 10% increase. Although there wasn't this creation of an oversight of the weighing process, the worker or the owners made promises that they would be sure that there were no accounting mistakes in weighing the coal loads, right? So that was acceptable. The one thing they would not budge on, and Teddy Roosevelt did not force, was the recognition of the union, right? So the workers didn't get that. But this is an unusual occurrence. The office of the presidency has been used to negotiate a settlement in a strike. It ended peacefully. And also, I should note that Teddy Roosevelt came to find that he respected the strike leaders more than he did the owners. The owners he saw were unreasonable and were seeking to expand the amount of money going into their pocket, and it didn't matter that it was detrimental to the rest of the nation. Whereas the strikers, their demands were reasonable and they were appeared to be honorable men. So Teddy, to his surprise, came to find that these representatives of the workers were people he respected more than the owners who would be from his own social class and social status. So this settlement, this is a possible model for the future. What? How do we know it's a possible model for the future? Because later in American history, it's the model that's adopted. The government serves a role as a negotiator or an arbitrator in these disputes between workers and owners. But that's not what happens here, right? This is a one-off. So it is a possible model for the future, but it is not one that is pursued. Instead, we have the normal run of things, right? And nicely illustrated by a strike that occurred the year before. The strike when the workers in the steel mill tried to strike for improved working conditions, for increased salaries and recognition of their union. In 1901, there was a large-scale attempt to strike against U.S. Steel, the largest by far steel holding company in the world. So U.S. Steel, the workers go on strike, and the owners of the steel mills resolve to break the strike. They refuse to negotiate with the workers. They bring in scabs. They hire thugs, the Pinkertons, to come beat up strikers outside of steel plants. And they use all the tactics. They get court injunctions, as we'll see. The court aligns itself with these companies. So all these things result in the strike failing. And the workers straggle back to the mine or to the steel mills, where they receive cuts in pay and limited opportunities. And those who were deemed the ringleaders of the strike or of this union effort are blackballed. They never work in steel again. Their names are circulated to other steel companies, so they can't, they're evicted from this business, right? The strike fails, the workers' attempt to unionize is crushed, the usual business of business and workers when they go on strike. Now, they have opposing worldviews, and one place to see where this is visible is in this notion of an open and a closed shop. Ownership wants an open shop, which means they can hire and fire at will, and the workers have no say in how things operate within the factory. It's purely up to the owner. Workers want a closed shop in which everybody who works in the shop or in the factory, the mine, whatever, they're all part of the union. And then the union negotiates collectively for all the workers, right? So you have two different ways of seeing the world. The ownership wants to completely control their labor and feel free to hire and fire at any time for any reason. The workers are looking for some sort of protection as a collective, right? So they want a closed shop, right? So you have this conflict that is just, again, it's the way of seeing the world, right? So the owners want to deal with this as individuals, hire and fire as I see fit. I, the owner, will determine the conditions in the factory. You, the worker, can work or not, right? Go find another job if you don't like it. Whereas the workers say, we work in this industry, we work in this factory, we want to have a collective to negotiate in our interest and to negotiate safer working conditions, right? In this early 20th century, there is the tensions between the workers and the ownership class have been increasing, and the strikes have become larger and more violent. Repressive methods of breaking strikes by owners have been employed. And so the owners recognize that they want to forestall this sort of radical action of the workers in forming unions and collectives. So they give something known as welfare capitalism, in which they try and provide for workers beyond just the wages, so that the workers are happier in doing their work. But they also want to shape it for things that benefit the company, right? So workers who go to taverns after work and drink all night, come back to work the next day hungover or still drunk, and are so less productive, right? So they want to give them something to do outside of leaving work and going to a tavern, so they create sports leagues. These, they donate baseball equipment and build some baseball diamonds. They, create team or company football teams, and they give them equipment and fields and set up schedules for them. They create golf courses, right, for the workers in their free time to use free or at a reduced rate. So these are gifts from the company to have the workers doing things that perpetuate what the owners want. They don't want them engaging in certain behaviors that make them less productive as workers. And they also want to encourage this idea of teamwork, so that the team playing together on the baseball diamond is a team that works on the factory line more efficiently, produces more. And they also, within the factory, have these sort of incentive programs where shifts are given a small bonus for producing more steel or something else in competition with other shifts. So all these things are about, the welfare capitalism is about trying to give the workers something that the owners give them, as opposed to what the workers demand themselves. The owners want to control their workers, right? And this is a perfect example of progressive era reform, or notions, I should say, not really reform, in which there's this idea that workers and production can be managed scientifically, right? And so you have companies adopting something known as Taylorism, which is the scientific management of the process of working in a factory in order to maximize production, right? So the Taylor method would study, for example, if you're working on a factory line and your job is to put a nut on a bolt, right? They would study this process in order to maximize the amount of, the least amount of time it took each worker to put the nut on the bolt. So where would you place the box of nuts? Where would you, how fast would you move the line? All these things are closely studied with the idea that we're going to make you more efficient, right? Scientifically managing this process to make you more efficient. But really behind the idea, or behind the facade of increasing efficiency, it's about controlling the workers. You can do things the way we tell you to do them, or you will be fired, right? And it's not just, you'll be fired because you're less efficient, and so the argument runs. So the labor relations between ownership and the working class during this time are quite fraught. There is a union, a large-scale union, but it's a type of union that is increasingly out of step with the way the nation is producing. There is a union known as the American Federation of Labor, right? It's the largest union at this time. But the AFL, as it is known, is a craft labor business. And they are organized in skilled tasks, right? So what are some skilled tasks? So shoemakers, making a pair of shoes is a skill, right? You, the system of learning how to produce fine shoes requires an apprenticeship, where you spend a time working with someone who's a master craftsman. And over time, the techniques of that master craftsman are taught to the apprentice, right? So if you think about how to make a shoe, a skilled shoemaker measures your foot, cuts out the various pieces of the leather, sews them and glues them together, creates a shoe for your foot, right? It begins with measuring your foot so that this shoe is a perfect fit for you. Building or making a shoe from start to finish, from measuring to finished product, is a very skilled job. So very few people could do this. So the people who could do that formed into a craft union of skilled shoemakers, right? This skill of making shoes is one that gives them an advantaged position, right? Because they can dictate to the buyers what it's going to cost, right? If I put in 2 days work to make you a pair of shoes, you're going to have to pay me $10, right? If you don't like the price for $10, well, go find another cobbler to do it, but you can't find another cobbler not charging $10 because all the cobblers in town are part of the craft union. They say, our price for making shoes is 10, right? So if everybody in the union is charging the same price, well, then you have to pay that price. What happens in this latter 19th and now into the early 20th century is that this is industrial factory production, which is de-skilling the jobs, right? So being a cobbler is a skilled task. This skilled task requires someone to master the skills of measuring, cutting, sewing, gluing, molding this material to fit precisely 1 foot. It's a complicated endeavor. I'll give you another example in a second. It's a skill in order to do it. But this skill is broken down to its individual steps and then put on a factory assembly line. So there is someone whose job is to take a pattern and put it on a piece of leather and just cut that pattern out of the leather all day long, producing part of the shoe. And then they pass it on to the next thing, who's the person's task is to sew the top and bottom together. And so by taking each step of the process and breaking it down to its simplest tasks, you create the ability to make a multitude of shoes in a very short period of time. Also, because you are opening up who can make these shoes, the simple task of cutting out a pattern, you have opened up the amount of people who can do this job. And so there's people competing for this job, so your labor costs are continually reduced because people are willing to work less and less just to have a job, or work for less and less just in order to have a job. And so the upside is many more shoes are available for purchase. They may not be of the same high quality, but they're, you get the benefit of the consumers, because now there's a lot more shoes to purchase. For the workers, their skilled task is now been de-skilled, and so they have no claim to special skills that require that you use a cobbler, so they're driven out of business, right? Another example of this skilled task. Steel making, there used to be a skilled task in which somebody was known as a puddler. And a puddler's job was to add the proper amount of carbon at the right temperature in order to produce superior steel. It is a task that was learned over years of apprenticeship. And so puddlers were skilled craftsmen within the steel industry who had learned over the years these tasks, or how much carbon to add when. It was more an art than it was a science, let's say, right? So for these reasons, puddlers were paid very well and were in high demand, because a superior puddler, his company would produce better steel, which company owners would then be able to market, right? This superior steel. What happened is the steelmaking process got turned into a step-by-step cookbook process, right? In which each step is carefully studied by experts who determine precisely how much carbon to add when. So when it's turned into a recipe, then anybody can do it. And so that job of making steel, of adding a certain amount of carbon at certain times, has been de-skilled. So the puddlers have lost their competitive edge for their sales. So this craft labor business is under threat because increasingly workers are part of an industrial de-skilled production method rather than a skilled task. It's becoming a smaller percentage of the laboring workforce each day. So, looking at it objectively, we can say, well, if the AFL wanted to keep its power, because the power of a union is in the size of its numbers, they should have incorporated some of these other workers into the union to keep their power, negotiating power. But that's not what happened. Why that didn't happen is partly about the AFL. This craft labor union, they don't like the industrial workers, right? They see them as unskilled workers and so beneath them. Many of these craft laborers are second and third and fourth generation here in the United States, so they consider themselves old stock. Many of them from are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and so they look down on these ethnic immigrants, these Jews and Catholics, Italians, Ukrainians, Russians flooding into the nation. They look down on them, so they certainly don't want them associated with them in the union. So they refuse to open it up. They also have very bad relations with two other set of folks here in this nation. They have very bad relations with the Black community because the AFL is racist. Many old stock white Americans at the turn of the 20th century viewed other races with disdain, none more than they viewed the Black population with disdain. Right, and so basically because of racist notions, they don't want to open up the AFL to any Black membership, no matter if they're skilled in making or in the crafts that are part of the AFL or not. They also view the Black population as scabs, as strike breakers, because historically the Black population have been used by the ownership as scabs to break strikes. And so I'll give you an example. So there's a strike in meat packing factories in Chicago. The companies go down into the deep South where people are laboring in sharecropper status and say, hey, we got great jobs for you up in Chicago. They load up the train with a bunch of sharecroppers down from Mississippi. They bring them to Chicago, and then they use them as scabs to break the strike. And then when the strike is broken, they lay off the Black population, who have now removed from Mississippi to Chicago and are, bearing the title as scabs or strike breakers. The craft union doesn't want to share their skilled jobs with other folks. They want to keep control of these skilled jobs, so that also makes them unwilling to work with the Black population. They have bad relations with women workers, right? They view women workers as people who don't really need to work. They're working for what they call pin money, a little extra money, and they're willing to work for less. So because women will work for less, it undercuts what the man would be paid for his job, right? So it undercuts the ability of men to charge certain prices because women doing the same tasks or skilled tasks are willing to do it for less. Partly it's because women were paid less, right? Women were faced with the option of taking less money or not working at all. So people in desperate circumstances work for less money. So I don't want to say that the AFL, some of their charges are not unfounded. Women will work for less because that's all they would be paid. But it's primarily because they're racist and misogynist. So these things prevent the AFL from expanding. But the greatest problem at all is that the system of production is changing to unskilled industrial labor, and they will not open up their union to these folks. Okay. So another example of, or a further example of how things normally operate in the turn of the 20th century. We see this counterexample of Teddy Roosevelt, the government serving as a negotiating or mediator. That's not normally how things happen. Normally, the government sides with the owners, right? And so an example that McGerr cites is the Western Federation of Miners out in Colorado. They go on strike. They call for sympathy strikes in some other places. So the workers are out on strike. The owners have difficulty breaking the strike. So what do? They go to the governor, and they ask the governor to use the state militia to help break the strike. And they do. And in fact, in a strike in Colorado, at the behest of ownership of a mine, requested that the governor call out the state guard. The state guard showed up with machine guns and shot up the strikers' encampment. So that's an extreme example. Normally, the government doesn't go to the extreme example of bringing machine guns to shoot strikers, but the government sides with owners, or tends to side with owners generally, right? So the government serves as the strike breaker of last resort, right? This role of government siding with ownership against the workers led some workers to form a more radical union, the IWW, the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, as they were called. The Wobblies believed that if the owners are going to use violent tactics in breaking up the strikes, then the workers should be prepared to respond violently as well, right? And so the conflicts between comparatively small number of Wobblies and owners in these, and more accurately, not the owners, their strike breakers like the Pinkertons, were increasingly violent. The government frequently arrested and harassed these Wobblies because they were more radical. They also were espousing socialist notions, so the government sided with the owners, arresting some of the leadership on trumped-up charges, but in general siding with the owners against these radical unions. The court system also tends to side with the owners. Partly this is because they're from the same class, the same ethnic background, the same economic class. They tend to side with the owners. They find more in common cause with them than they do with the workers, who tend to be immigrants and immigrants who speak different languages or practice different religions. So the courts tend to side with the owners, but there's also a larger issue that is part of this issue as well, and it goes back really to the founding of the nation. The founding of the nation, there's two arguments or two slogans that are part of the rhetoric of American Revolution. One argues for individual liberty, right? Give me liberty or give me death, as part of this notion of what the American Revolution is about and what the formation of this nation is. Independence, independent liberty of individuals, right? That's part of the rhetoric of American Revolution. The other part of that rhetoric of American Revolution is no taxation without representation. That's about property, right? The government should not be able to take your property through taxation. So protecting property is also part of the founding of this nation. Sometimes individual benefits and property are together, but sometimes they're in opposition. And those cases that come before the court, when you have property versus independent action, or in this case, property versus independent laborers, right, who are saying that the company is mistreating them, and so you have what in effect are property versus liberty issues coming to the fore. In these cases, in the early 20th century, the courts almost always sided with property concerns, right? So when there is a dispute, the courts on this issue that goes back to the founding of the nation tended to side with property. In the latter 20th century, mid to latter 20th century, now in the 21st century, these issues have been largely resolved along independent or liberty issues rather than property. Property has taken a backseat, and I'll give you an example. I do some research in public health, so there are issues in public health where the charges came along the line of what's called nuisance trade. So the courts ruled you had a right to do whatever you wanted with your property, unless your use of your property caused damage to somebody else. You are free to use your property unless it infringes on the liberty of somebody else. The undergirding of public health law grew out of this idea of nuisance trades that were damaging to your neighbors downstream. There weren't many of those cases, but as we get further into when you get into the 20th century, they begin to place greater emphasis on protecting people from property use that causes danger to other people, right? So in the early 20th century, though, still the court system tended to favor property concerns over labor concerns in this case. So despite the initial promise that McGerr sketches out in this Umw strike, right, a comparatively peaceful end to a bitter strike in which the government played a role as a mediator rather than strike breaker of last resort, despite this initial promise, it's really a one-off. Normally, strikes are resolved in the way U.S. Steel strike ended in 1901. The owners use all the tactics they can, including the court system, to break the strike and prevent the workers from forming unions, and then punish the workers for trying to unionize, right? So this class conflict between owners and labor continues. And in these conflicts, not all the time, but most of the time, owners win these conflicts, all right? Okay, so that's where we are in the early 20th century, talking about, during this progressive era, talking about labor and ownership issues. And next time we will talk about big business. See you next time.